aliens. Why would they still be here if they feared it?
Why would I make them so uncomfortable?
Who are you people?
So what do you think is the biggest threat right now?
I think the biggest threat's the FBI, the NSA, and their counterparts in foreign governments. I mean, these are all essentially, companies, right, that try to justify their budgets in various ways, often by scaremongering.
I make this look good.
What are the Men in Black? People have been reporting their own Men in Black experiences and eyewitness accounts since the beginning of the UFO cover-up history. The burning question in most people's minds surrounding the infamous MIB accounts is, what are the Men in Black?
Well, the Men in Black is a concept that's been in the UFO field since really the beginning of the UFO field, essentially. And there's a weird thing about it because there's always been two different components to this phenomenon. There are cases where a UFO witness or someone who has some connection to the UFO phenomenon is then accosted by usually two individuals, often in pairs, sometimes singular, sometimes even more than two, but often two. And there are times when very ordinary, human-looking intelligence types approach someone and either warn them off of their investigation or will actually make it very clear to them that they're dealing with a UFO phenomenon. But in all cases, the idea is to scare off or intimidate the witness so that they don't pursue whatever it is that they're looking into.
Yeah, it all seems pretty horrible, especially if they threaten you or threaten your family, and you're not sure if they're from another planet or not.
Historical accounts of the Men in Black recall the overwhelming sensation of fear experienced by those who have had prior encounters with UFOs or something out of the extraordinary. This fear is a tool used to suppress an incredible UFO event from the public. What are their true goals? Are they outdated military relics from the past, or are they covertly influencing today's society through misinformation, fake news? The earliest recorded encounter with a man in black was in 1947. Harold Dahl, a conservationist, was near the shore of Murray Island in Washington.
Dahl's job was to retrieve serviceable lumber that was often just floating around in the water back in those days. And he would bring it back, and that would be their business. That's their business model. And so Dahl is out in a boat for this purpose with his teenage son and dog, actually. And he sees 6 discs. We're talking, this is June 1947. This is actually right before, a couple of days before, Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting of flying saucers over by Mount Rainier in the state of Washington. So just a few days before that, Dahl is out in his boat in the water, and he sees these 6 disc-like objects. One of them's in trouble. Wobbling, and it seems to be losing its stability. And the other discs come toward it, according to his description. And this disc that's in trouble releases material that almost looked like some kind of slag that is like a rocky type of material that comes out. And according to what Dahl said, some of this material hit his son, injuring his son's arm, and supposedly killed his dog. And then after the object lost its material, it regained its stability, and all of these objects then departed. So Dahl spoke to his supervisor, Fred Chrisman. Here's where the Men in Black scenario comes in with Harold Dahl. The next day, what it comes down to is there's a diner. There was a diner in that area where he's having breakfast the next day, and he has a conversation with this mysterious man he's never met before. Dahl initially expected this man was a lumber dealer, and he was expecting just to do a standard business arrangement with this guy. He dealt with strangers all the time who were interested in lumber. It turns out this man was nothing of the sort. This man then relates every single thing that had happened to Dahl the previous day. And he knew all about it. To Dahl's shock, I mean, that would be a shocking thing for anyone to experience. And this mysterious man essentially said, look, you're just going to leave this alone, and you're not going to pursue this in any way whatsoever if you know it's good for you. And so that's an intimidating experience for so many reasons. You can imagine poor Harold Dahl thinking, this is 1947. You're in America in 1947. You're not under the assumption that you're living in a surveillance state. And so you can imagine the shock he had to have felt thinking, wait, what? How do you know about anything that happened to me yesterday? So there's that level. And then there's the implied threat from this man, which just added to it. Dahl did not have in his possession the slag at the time. There was an enormous amount of this stuff. So, like, we're talking much more than any one person could carry around with them. The bulk of this ended up in the possession of Fred Chrisman, Dahl's boss. And eventually, the United States Air Force sends 2 men to investigate and retrieve whatever this material is. And they actually do get to do this, and they load all of this slag material onto a Air Force transport. Actually, this is Army Air Corps at the time. This is just before the Air Force has become an independent, unified entity separate from the Army. So they come up from McCord Airfield in California to acquire this material, and they do. And on their way back from Maury Island, their plane catches fire and goes down, and they die. That's what happened. And after that, I don't know what happened to the slag material or whatever this was, but their plane crashed.
What is the true mission of the Men in Black? Is it the suppression of information regarding UFOs and extraterrestrials? Or is it to aid them and further their agenda?
Well, let me tell you, Jim, I've had visits from government agents, various alphabet-type organizations connected to the work that I do here. And they are, even though they seem easygoing and very nice guys, there is no question about it, Jim. I'm just talking about normal government agents here. In black suits, you know they're carrying, they've got a sort of a serious, we're here and you don't want to mess with us kind of attitude about them. And even though they're very nice and very calm, there's no question about the fact that there is an aura of intimidation that you could cut with a knife.
So relating to the story of a man named Albert Bender, who also had a very interesting experience, which actually coined the phrase Men in Black. Bender was one of the earliest organizers of kind of civilian UFO groups. It was the International Flying Saucer Bureau. It was a publication that was quite successful by 1952 standards, you know, printing out the publication, mailing it out, and getting subscriptions that way. It's not easy. It wasn't easy to do back then.
Albert K. Bender founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau in 1952 during the big UFO flap. Now, this is a phenomenon that he had been studying and following for years and decided that there needed to be one centralized location to put all of this information that had been gathered.
But he was doing a pretty good job. Now, 1952 was a very big year for UFOs in the United States, a very, very big year. You know, according to Project Blue Book, which was doing investigations and taking reports, that was by far the biggest year they had. Yeah, you could say the Project Blue Book was, you could say the first ATIP, you know, the advanced aerial threat identification program that we've learned about since then. But in Blue Book, they had over 1,500 UFO reports for that year, which is all pre-internet. To get that many reports that people send in that's a lot. A lot of those were very intense military encounters, like very well documented. This is the year that, for 2 weekends in a row, flying saucers were seen over the Capitol in Washington, D.C. that summer. It was the summer in which the United States Air Force held an enormous press conference all about this. It was a year in which, if you were to go into Wright-Patterson Air Force Base's Project Blue Book office, according to Edward Ruppelt, who was running it back then, he said, if you were to come in here, you would have thought there was an invasion underway. It was that intense. There were a lot of people in the military who actually believed that the secret was going to come out that year. That's how big it was. So in the midst of all that, you have a young guy like Bender who is investigating this on his own, and he's getting contributions from other writers, and he's got a decent publication going. It's quite successful.
Now, this blew up and went international immediately. Within that first year, he already had offices in the UK and also Australia. And you have to realize this is long before the internet and cell phones and our current technology. He was doing all of this through snail mail and, if he could afford it, long distance telephone calls back when you had to pay long distance charges. So on a very limited budget, he was able to make this very large organization that was compiling all of this information on UFO activity at the time, and also producing a newsletter that would get mailed out as well.
And then, seemingly out of the blue, in March 1953, he just shuts the whole thing down and just runs away. And no one hears from Albert Bender. He just makes this quick announcement, I'm done, we're not doing this anymore, see ya.
Nobody really knew what truly happened. Gray Barker, a writer and publisher at that time, also involved in the UFO community, tried to get some details out of him and published a few scant details during the mid-1950s, but never really got a clear answer. But then in the early 1960s, a little over 10 years later, Gray Barker published a book by Albert K. Bender called Flying Saucers and the Three Men, where Albert K. Bender told his story about what had really happened to him.
And 9 years after that, in 1962, Bender wrote a book called Flying Saucers and the Three Men, and he gives the story about why this all happened. Why did he shut it down in 1953? And here's where we get into a definite paranormal description of the Men in Black.
Now, what Bender claimed is that he started being visited by three strange men. He would go into his bedroom at night, and all of a sudden, three shadowy figures would materialize through the walls. Now, these figures were very dark in nature. They were wearing hats, almost like a fedora style, and they had glowing eyes. Now, when I first heard this story, coming from a paranormal background like I do, I immediately thought of shadow people, the hat-wearing shadow entities that many people talk about observing and having interactions with. Now, Albert K. Bender believed that these were actually extraterrestrials, that they had come to warn him off of all the work that he was doing, and these guys are the reason why he disbanded the International Flying Saucer Bureau. Now, other people hear this story and they believe this is a Men in Black story, that it was the Men in Black that had arrived and warned him off of all of his flying saucer research. Now, with Bender, what he believed that these entities were, that they were ETs, they were extraterrestrials from some other world that had come to our planet to harvest resources down in Antarctica, where they were harvesting these resources out of the water. They were here on a 15-year mission to do so, and Albert Bender could not say anything about the true nature of what he had observed, who he was interacting with, and why he had disbanded the International Flying Saucer Bureau until these ETs had left Earth, which is why several years later in the 1960s, he came forth with his story and published the book through Gray Barker.
He noted that they had red eyes, So anytime you're going to see a being that can mysteriously enter your room and they've got red eyes, I think the implication is going to be that these aren't quite from our neighborhood. They're from somewhere else. So Bender, you know, it's tough enough for people to accept this ordinary paranormal element of the story. I mean, that's difficult enough. Then he added that they gave him, well, they gave the reason why he couldn't investigate this. And they, according to Bender, they said, well, we're mining in Antarctica. And this is very important, and we don't want you to disturb this and cause us any trouble. And they gave him, according to Bender, they gave him a medallion and stated, when this medallion disappears, that will mean that we're gone. And then you can talk about us. You cannot talk about us until then. And according to that reasoning, the medallion disappeared, I guess, in the early 1960s, prompting Bender to write his book, which was published in 1962. And, you know, I mean, it's not difficult to understand why people would have a very hard time to believe that. Where's the evidence? Oh, well, the evidence disappeared. No medallion. Antarctica, like, especially in 1950s, and, you know, there would be no reason anyone would possibly think that there was work going on in Antarctica, the most remote, desolate part of the planet. Pretty fantastic. Nowadays, there's all kinds of talks and rumors about Antarctica in the UFO field. It never stops.
Fully illuminated round object was hovering silently over the missile silo and shining a light down onto it.
And then from this dead stop, it shoots off to the east, just like now you see it, now you don't.
This planet is being visited by beings from another world.
In 1964, Dr. Robert Jacobs was in charge of the optical instrumentation of ballistic missile testing. There, he recorded footage of an ICBM and was surprised to find the extraordinary. Here, he recalls the events in detail.
And flying downrange, we got all three stages of powered flight, and as the dummy warhead and the package flew on down range, we were all celebrating the fact that we had seen the thing and accomplished the mission.
So another interesting story concerned a man named Dr. Robert Jacobs, who was a highly qualified scientific professional who in 1964, he was very much involved in film recording of missile launches out of White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, where ballistic missiles were being tested. And what they would do is they would launch these missiles and then record them.
And flying downrange, we got all three stages of powered flight, and as the dummy warhead and the package flew on down range, we were all celebrating the fact that we had seen the thing and accomplished the mission. When I got back to the base with the film the next day, I was called into the office of Major Florence J. Mansman, and there were three people in gray suits standing in there. There was a 16mm camera and a screen setup. Major Mansman said, "Lieutenant, sit down and watch this." And suddenly he said, "Just watch this." And as I watched, the warhead, the dummy warhead, the chaff that was put out in front of it as a decoy to deflect the Russian anti-missile tracking radar.
And during one of these tests, the missile just went completely haywire and didn't perform as expected. It crashed. And on review of the film the next day, what Jacobs and his supervisor, was a major, noticed that there was an object, a UFO.
Everything was flying along, and suddenly, in the same direction this stuff was flying at about 8,000 miles an hour, an object came into the frame, shot a beam of light at the warhead, flew up to the top, shot another beam of light at the warhead, flew around the direction it was flying, shot another beam of light at the warhead, flew down, shot another beam of light at the warhead, and flew out the same way it came in.
Well, I don't see why didn't you see this when you were shooting it?
Well, it was 600 to 800 miles away from us.
Like a saucer type of an object that was clearly interacting with this missile And it was when this object appeared, the missile went, and I think it shot like a laser or a beam. I think it was a very well-defined laser type of a beam that was directed at this missile. And at that moment, the missile went off course and just crashed.
Well, first of all, the Major Mansman said to me, "What was that? Were you guys screwing around up there?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Then tell me what that was." And I said, "We got a UFO."
After choosing to discuss the event, Dr. Jacobs reports disruptions in his daily life. People calling at all times of the day and night, threatening his life, which has escalated into property damage. Intimidation is one of many techniques used to instill fear.
And he said, "Lieutenant, you are never to speak of this again. As far as you're concerned, this didn't happen."
Eventually, Major Mansman confirmed Dr. Jacobs' claims of a UFO interacting with the ICBM. The Major also disclosed that 2 agents who were not the CIA took the footage and altered it. All film evidence of the UFO and its interactions with the missile were missing. The Major reported that one agent said to him, "That leaves you off the hook, but not off disclosure." Understood?
Somehow the Major had said to Jacobs that these men told him they erased the flying saucer from this film. And they said, "You're off the hook, but you're not off of disclosure." In other words, you're not in trouble now because we've cleaned the film up, but don't you talk about it. So that's 1964, and Jacobs, then you fast forward to the Disclosure Project with Dr. Stephen Greer. We're talking late 1990s now, when Jacobs did an interview with Greer and talked about this event. And that was published in Greer's book, I think, the following year, in 2000. And what Jacobs said in the aftermath of that was that he was subject to a range of harassment type of activities. Some of these things would include threatening phone calls at all times of the day, and even to vandalism against his property, property damage, and acts of intimidation of this sort, which, yeah, that's going to intimidate people. So the whole point of this type of activity, obviously, would be to frighten you, the witness, enough to realize you better not talk about this because you're dealing with people who will do damage to you. And, you know, if they can wiretap your phone or if they can threaten you at any time of the day, who knows what they're capable of doing.
Happened to a Dr. Hopkins in Maine in 1976. He was met or contacted by a man in black who was bald, had dead white skin, and no lips. The lips were simulated with lipstick.
Now, there have been some visits by these types of individuals in which the witness doesn't believe that they're fully human. So there's an odd component to some of these encounters. And in fact, when you really go through some of those descriptions, it's easy to see why people would conclude that. Some of those individuals are described physically as having very pasty skin or very unusual physical features, like very thin, clothes don't fit them properly, odd behavioral characteristics. In some cases, the witness will say that they almost seem to lose power or energy in the middle of the interview, and then they just leave, as if they're like robots running out of battery power, you know, something like that. So you get these two disparate types of men in black stories. And that's always been the tension that you get with the men in black phenomenon. Are we dealing with, you know, people working through the CIA or Air Force Office of Special Investigation or something like that? Or are you dealing with, I mean, really the implication is, are you dealing with non-humans posing as human beings for their own purposes? And that's always been the tension.
As witnesses continue to come forward with their experiences, it is believed that the men in black shifted their approach to publicly debunking those claims through proxy. Credible reports of abductions circulated throughout the UFO community and was met with heavy skepticism by debunkers.
He got his start as a debunker in the mid-1960s with the idea of ball lightning to explain away one particular interesting UFO event. Through the 60s, made it his personal vendetta to destroy the career of James McDonald, the atmospheric physicist, who was very, very strong UFO proponent. And then by the 1970s, Klass really was hitting the big time in terms of media attention and in terms of his prominence as a UFO skeptic. Certainly by the 1970s, Philip Klass had become the #1 active UFO skeptic by far.
Credible reports of abductions circulated throughout the UFO community and was met with heavy skepticism by debunkers.
Are you a debunker of all UFO stories?
Well,
is that your purpose?
I look for explanations.
Now, you know, you can look at probably the most prominent skeptic of UFOs during the starting from the mid-60s, right through the rest of the 20th century, was a man named Philip J. Klass. Now, Klass wasn't a true man in black, the way that previous men in black were described, you know, coming into your house and threatening you. Klass worked in a different way. He engaged in countless smear campaigns through the media to discredit individuals associated with UFOs, most famously the atmospheric physicist James McDonald, who is really a hero in the UFO field, and rightly so. Klass went after McDonald like a war, a personal vendetta. Klass was someone who was so well positioned through his contacts in Washington, D.C., where he lived and worked. He was a senior editor for a very prominent aerospace aviation magazine, and he was very well connected. Klass always seemed to have information on people. He had this way, and this went throughout his entire career.
There is no more exciting story that I could write or Aviation Week could publish than to say, at last, we've come across one UFO report that cannot be explained in prosaic terms. Maybe this is an alien spaceship. Biggest story of all time. Yet in more than 22 years as a hobby of investigating famous, mysterious UFO cases, reports, I have never found one that cannot be explained in prosaic earthly terms.
He once tried to bribe one of Travis Walton's co-workers. You know, Travis Walton had the very famous UFO encounter in 1975 where he was missing for 5 days. Klass actually tried to bribe one of Walton's cohorts to deny the whole thing ever happened. He offered him $10,000. This is how Klass worked constantly.
You know, just like Philip Klass when he offered me the $10,000. That was a lot of money back in the 70s.
And there's always been very, very strong suspicion, no proof that I'm aware of, but very strong circumstantial evidence that Klass was some kind of asset to the U.S. intelligence community doing work for them to discredit the UFO subject. He definitely was promoted by Edward Condon of the famous Condon Committee from the late 1960s that infamously tried to debunk UFOs scientifically.
Our latest book, Stanton Friedman and I have written Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers. It's based upon years of archival research. He went to Harvard, read Donald Menzel's archival files. I went to the American Philosophical Society. I made several trips there. And what I found in the correspondence files was a plan to debunk those individuals who had very compelling cases, and also to attempt to reduce the credibility of scientists who had an interest in investigating UFOs and who are speaking publicly about that. I have a letter that Dr. Edward Condon wrote to McGraw-Hill, and in that letter, Edward Condon stated, if you need anyone in the media to make public statements about UFOs, I would advise you to use Philip Klass.
But Condon certainly worked hard to try to promote Philip Klass as much as possible as someone who would be relied upon to give the proper perspective on UFOs, that is the skeptical debunking attitude on UFOs through the media. Klass is someone who was able to get New York Times op-ed pieces and articles like no problem. He was on CNN all the time, Larry King. He was always able to get access to major media in a way that normal UFO researchers would have just, you know, given up an arm to be able to have, but Klass just had this magical ability to connect with all major media. And you could certainly say that Klass is a new version of a man in black, not in any way like the mysterious, intimidating figures coming to your house. He would just smear you and try to destroy your career.
What was recovered was a radar target, balloon borne.
That is the cover story that was put out. We know it was a cover story based on the testimony of the people who put out the cover story.
Whatever happened at Westall, whatever the objects were, they were being tracked. They were being tracked from where they were coming from. They'd been tracked over previous days, and there was some sense of there being a surveillance going on of these objects, and that's why the response could be as fast as it was to Westall. That's why the military could get there as quickly as they did that day, because there was some, if you like, forewarning that perhaps these objects had been seen elsewhere in Australia in the preceding days. Certainly we have the famous photograph of a UFO taken in the suburb of Baldwin, about 20 kilometres from Westall, just 4 days before the Westall incident. And that photograph was leaked to a Melbourne newspaper, the Herald, and published, and caused a huge furore at the time, so much so that the person who took the photograph himself, even though he didn't want it published in the newspaper, he gave it to a friend who leaked it. He never wanted it made public, but it was. And it then resulted in the Air Force visiting him at his home. An interview was held with him. And he claims to this day that he thinks the Air Force was so concerned about that photograph going into the newspaper was because it showed the object that was seen at Westall 4 days later. Or there was some connection with whatever that object was that he caught in his Polaroid photograph and with what happened at Westall. So that's an ongoing mystery. How could it be that an object of unknown origin, an object that flew in ways that were completely inexplicable to anybody who witnessed it, how there could be such a rapid response by the military, whether it was the Army or the Air Force?
There's another very interesting case in Australia, outside of the city of Melbourne, in the south part of Australia, in a town called Westall. And this is 1966. This is an incredible UFO incident. I had the privilege of visiting Westall myself some years ago and going to the schoolyard where all of this happened. And the story was, you have all the kids run out of the school because someone saw this UFO coming over the property there. So you got 200 kids of all ages and teachers. There were adults and youths that were watching this. The object, by all of the witness accounts, either landed or almost landed on the property, like very, very low. In fact, one girl, she was like in junior high school age, I think she was like 12 or 13. She got the closest to it, and according to the witnesses, like, she was not ever seen again. She moved far away after this. That's an odd thing. But what we know for certain, there was a science teacher named Daniel who stated that these looked like Australian Air Force came to his house. And there were 2 of them, and they absolutely threatened his career and possibly his freedom if he was to continue talking about this event. Like, they made it clear in no uncertain terms, you're not going to talk about this, or you're gonna have some serious repercussions.
Remember, the military arrived. The emergency services arrived. There was a response by police, the fire brigade, by the Civil Defence Organisation. There was a response by the Commonwealth Police. There is a report from a witness who was a news stringer at the time that a cordon was thrown up around the streets of Westall by police officers in uniforms that were a little unknown to him, using vehicles that were a little unknown to him, but they looked like police officers and police vehicles. And when he returned to the TV station later that day, he was informed that, yes, they were Commonwealth police officers, not Victorian state police officers, but Commonwealth police officers. So it looks like there was some involvement at that level as well.
While I think that it might have started out with a paranormal element, I think it may have been that the government tweaked this and they used it as a psychological operation or a test tube to try out various forms of psychological control.
Japan Airlines Flight 1628, en route to Tokyo from Paris, when the crew noticed two UFOs with flowing lights which flew next to the plane in patterns and speeds which were unachievable with modern aviation.
Controller had asked the military man, do you see anything? The military guy says, yes, I have a target at such and such. 1 o'clock and 8 miles from the Japanese pilot, 747. The military man said something like, yeah, I see him 35 miles north of Anchorage. And who's that at 11 or 1 o'clock in his position? And the FAA controller said, I don't have anybody. Do you have anybody? He said, it's not mine. And he came back and said, we have no traffic here. And a couple times during the operation, the Japanese pilot would say he's now at 11 o'clock, he's now at 1 o'clock, he's now at 3 o'clock, he was bouncing around, this guy here. And when he would say that, the military guy would cut in and say he's now at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and he would confirm the position. The military controller has what they call height-finding radar, and they have long-range radar and short-range radar. So if they don't catch it on one of their systems, they catch it on the other. And if you listen to the military man, at one time he said, I have it on the height radar or my range radar, whatever he called it, which indicated that he had a target on his system. Oz wouldn't record it. While they ran through for the best part of 31 minutes, the UFO would be in one position or the other following our Japanese 747. After a while, they changed his altitude. It still stayed with him. They gave him a 360. When you're a 747, you make a 360, it takes you a few minutes to turn around. You cover a lot of space. It still stayed with him. It was either in the front, on the side, or behind him.
10, I approve 1628 to make deviations as necessary for traffic. The traffic stayed with 1628 through turns and descents in the vicinity of Fairbanks.
There's another very interesting, we can call this a Men in Black incident in a way. And by the way, relating to that encounter, good old Philip J. Klass was able to work his way with his organization, which was called SciCop, the scientific committee to investigate claims of the paranormal. They have a different name now. And they were able to get a piece in the New York Times, during all of that, to debunk the whole thing and say, well, it was just a planet Jupiter. You guys don't know what you're seeing. You made a big mistake. But in 1986, we have an interesting occurrence. On November 17th of that year, there was a flight called JAL, Japan Airlines Flight 1628, from Tokyo, and they were going over the Arctic Circle area, actually flying down over the state of Alaska, when this entire 29-minute recorded incident occurred, in which this airliner was accosted by an enormous, absolutely enormous object that there's drawings of it by the pilot, whose name was Kenjiro Terauchi. And it's almost like this massive, like the planet Saturn. It's like this big, big, roundish object. They're watching it and they're scared out of their mind. And they've got it on their airborne radar. The ground radar also is tracking this thing. And as I recall, at least one other airliner in the area saw this thing visually. So there's lots of data points here. What's interesting about this case is that they're flying side by side, this gigantic object, and it releases a smaller object, or at least I think it must release it, because this smaller object gets in front of their cockpit. And in fact, it's two of them where their cockpit is bathed in this green light for a while. But as they're flying, these objects are pacing them, like they're in front of the cockpit. And with maneuverability that's, like, there's no way to explain how these objects could do the things that they're doing. They eventually depart. You can imagine the fear. So Terauchi is getting permission to try to move his aircraft differently just to get away from this thing. And the entire experience lasted for 29 minutes in terms of the actual observation.
The next day, I got a call from someone with the scientific study group or the CIA. I'm not sure who it was the first time. And they wanted to know, they had some questions about the incident. And I had said, I don't know what you're talking about. You probably want to call the Admiral. A few minutes later, the Admiral calls down and says, I set up a briefing tomorrow morning at 9 or 10 o'clock, what it was. In the round room, bring all the stuff you have, bring everybody up there, and give them whatever they want.
So that's interesting enough. In the aftermath of that, there was an FAA, a Federal Aviation Administration meeting, where they're discussing this. They've got all the radar data. In this meeting, and this is now according to one of the men who attended, his name is John Callahan, and he was an FAA senior official with the Federal Aviation Administration. And so what happened, according to Callahan's very vivid, explicit testimony, was that at one point these two men in dark suits enter the room. No one knows where they're from. Is it assumed that they're from CIA? I don't think that's ever made clear where these guys are from. But they come in and they confiscate all of the data, and they are warning everyone, you are never, ever, ever going to talk about this ever again. We're taking all of your evidence. So Callahan kept his copy. That was the thing. He didn't give it up. He didn't let them know. They didn't ask. I don't think they asked him directly for it. And he just kind of slid below the radar, as it were, in this meeting and left it with his copy of the radar data. And it was about 13 years later, I think, in the late 90s, where he is interviewed by Stephen Greer of the Disclosure Project at that time and told his story. And so what you've got here is another incident of very clear, this is not a paranormal Men in Black experience by any means. These are government guys. These are spooks who are confiscating the evidence. Now, who are they? Are they CIA? Are they NSA? Are they something else? Are they from the Majestic 12 or whatever, you know, comparable organization there would be to Majestic 12? Maybe it's called Zodiac. That's a very possibility. That's a big possibility. But they're from a group that their job was to take that UFO data. And Callahan is really worth listening to. He's a very upfront, extremely candid, very articulate, very smart man. And he's got the credibility and the background to back up what he said. That's the thing that makes him so compelling.
When they read the reports that come through, the FAA has to protect themselves, so you can't say you saw a target, even though this is what he said. So they made him change his report to position symbols, which makes it sound like it wasn't really a target. Well, if it's not a target, then a lot of the other position symbols that we're separating from aren't targets either. And when I read that, I thought, there's something fishy here, that somebody's worried about something rather than they're trying to cover up.
Who do the Men in Black work for? CIA? The FBI? The NSA? Something else entirely? Even in the military, the Men in Black are a mystery. Over the years, encounters with Men in Black have decreased as their legend has grown, even into pop culture. No longer are you interrogated and threatened by a government spook or a nameless agent from an unknown cabal of organizations. As proxies continue debunking and smearing credible witnesses, the Men in Black have evolved their technique to control the narrative through misinformation. Literally, fake news. Take Richard Doty, former special agent of the Air Force who was tasked with infiltrating the UFO community to instill doubt and misinformation of UFO encounters.
Men in Black have always been present in the UFO community since back in the 50s and 60s. And if the sighting or report of a sighting or acquisition of photographs were important to the government, the MIB, the Men in Black, would show up trying to obtain what information these witnesses had regarding the sighting or the acquisition of photographs. If they took some photographs, the MIB would show up and try to get those photographs. Ever since the 50s, people started seeing flying objects, reporting flying objects. Depending on the accuracy and the credibility of the people that observed these objects, and depending on what the government knew about what those sightings were, it would have depended on whether the government went out and got the information or tried to quiet the people, the witnesses that saw it. But it's happened. It's real. It's a controversial subject matter, both within the public and within the government. But my knowledge is I've actually been involved in the Men in Black, in that we didn't call them Men in Black, but there were people within a certain agency within the government, the Air Force Special Activities Center. They're the ones that control these Men in Black. There was a unit stationed at Fort Belvedere, Virginia, that dealt with obtaining information from witnesses. But the controversy, of course, centers around how these Men in Black, or number one, who they were, number two, how they obtained the information for witnesses, and number three, where that information went after the Men in Black got the information. Now, these Men in Black, as you call them, that are prominent within the UFO community, they have a mission. They're assigned to an intelligence unit. They're given a mission to go out and interview these witnesses that saw this, or that have already reported a sighting or collection of data, pictures, so forth, evidence. And so they're out there on a mission. Now, how they operate that from that point on is really up to them. How are they going to get that information? If you are the witness, and we've tried officially, where two Air Force officers come to you in uniform, not a Men in Black, but in uniform, come to you and say, we're from the United States Air Force, and I understand you have pictures of something that you saw last week, and we would like to see them because we think that those pictures could be of a classified project. So we would like you to show them to us. Well, if you say, they're my pictures, I took them, I don't have anything to the military, you don't have no jurisdiction over me, no, bye. And so the Air Force officers leave, and the next day or 2 days or 3 days later, you're visited by two other men. I'm U.S. government credentials, and you took pictures of a classified aircraft yesterday or whenever, and we need to look at those pictures. And you only have one way of doing this. You have to turn them over to us, or we're gonna go to the court of law or some other threat. So those are the type of operations that I've seen, I've been involved with. Whether they eventually turn it over, if they don't, there's other means that they can use. But there's other ways. Surreptitious entry into your home. You come home one night from the movies or going out for dinner, and you come home and you find your house to be perfectly the way that you left it, except that where those pictures were stored, the pictures are gone. Or the opposite will happen. You'll come home, the window will be broken, we had a burglar, and they stole this, they stole my television, they stole this, and they also stole those pictures. Now it looks like a burglar. So you call the local police and you tell the local police, and the local police are gonna say, well, so you had pictures taken, there's nothing we can do about that.
Jody, my girlfriend, woke up frequently seeing tall, black figures in the room looking down on her. Other times it would be simple mysteries, such as coming home to an apartment that had obviously been tampered with.
Paul Benowitz was a successful entrepreneur and scientist who lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. There, he unintentionally stumbled into radio transmissions from a secret military base just beyond the border of his city. Later, this base would become known as Dulce Base. Benowitz was then contacted and influenced by Richard Doty. Little did he know he would become a victim of a mass misinformation campaign that would end in tragedy.
Now, there is one person who has called himself a man in black who's very well known in the UFO community, and that is Richard Doty. Now, Richard Doty was a member of the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, AFOSI. That's like the Air Force's their version of the CIA, you could say, their intelligence agency. Part of his job was to protect U.S. Air Force technology, secrets, and things like this. And one of the things that the Air Force would do to protect those secrets is, like there's one instance that I know Doty has talked about in which there is a crash of a secret experimental aircraft, and witnesses actually had photographed it, and you have a situation of AFOSI going to meet with these witnesses, or this witness, and to say, look, this is a UFO, or let them believe it was a UFO and confiscate the images, rather than let them know, yeah, you actually photographed something that we're building that we don't want anyone else to know about.
Don't you think it's a UFO? Did you ever see a craft operated like that? You just have to put that idea in their minds. And I go back to the Paul Benowitz case, which I was involved with. Paul was already a believer. And what he was doing is he was taking pictures of the U.S. Air Force highly classified drone projects. The project was highly classified. I went to Paul, and Paul was already a believer. He was already a member of MUFON. So it was very easy for him, for me. I said, what do you think it is, Paul? He said, I think it's a UFO. I think it's alien craft. I said, you know what? Could very well be. That's all I had to say. And Paul ran with it and believed it, and the rest is history.
You know, you can believe this or not, at least some of those things that witnesses photographed were not ours, and they were not Russian. So there were instances, according to him, at least is my understanding, in which there were objects that were not from here, but they wanted that information as well. Now, again, is this true or not? Who knows?
We were able to, and this isn't classified anymore, one of the things that Paul Benowitz had also kind of stumbled into by recording signals was our ability to shoot a laser at a ground-based laser station up into space, and as the Soviet satellite came over, that laser would hit the lens and blind the satellite while it's going over a certain base, preventing that satellite to take pictures of a base. Now, there was a satellite base at Kirtland Air Force Base and one out at Groom Lake. It was actually two out at Groom Lake, one at their different locations. And that's every time a Soviet satellite would come over, they'd shoot that laser up and blind it so they would be able to take a picture of what was on the ground.
But here's what we know about Mr. Benowitz. He was a very smart, capable defense contractor. He lived in Albuquerque, right by Kirtland Air Force Base, right at the Manzano weapons storage facility, which is very important. And his office was right across from there. And he witnessed things that he believed were very strange. We're talking 1979, 1980. And Benowitz was a real patriot. And he contacted the Air Force. He said, look, I'm recording things over there that these are like UFOs. And he openly told them. I think we're talking November 1980. And this is when Doty gets alerted to this, and he is sent along with other individuals. Doty's not the only one. They go to visit Benowitz to find out, like, what does this guy have? And the reality, apparently, is that Doty and Benowitz became genuine friends. I mean, probably his job was to befriend Benowitz, but I do think that they actually ended up liking each other. But Doty was working Benowitz, and his job absolutely was to protect any secrets that the folks over at Kirtland needed him to protect. That was his job. So, you know, according to how Doty has often told this story, and I think this part we can say is true, Benowitz was a very, very strong UFO believer to start with. And even before he was seeing things over by Kirtland, he was involved in at least one, let's call it an investigation of a cattle mutilation incident and abduction relating to a woman named Myrna Hansen, who went through hypnotic regression, I believe, in fact, by Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who's a very well-known individual in this. And Benowitz was there, and Myrna Hansen was regressed, and she gave a very detailed account of of being taken to an underground facility. It's like very heavy-duty stuff. So Benowitz was deeply involved in all of this. Then he sees so he sees things and he's recording emissions that he believes are like a form of alien communication. So with that, Doty and his team go to talk to Benowitz. And did Doty explicitly give Benowitz false information, or did he show Benowitz things and let Benowitz draw his own conclusions? I think definitely the latter happened, and maybe some of the former happened also. For example, there was one story where Doty took Benowitz to Dulce, New Mexico. Now, Dulce has a legitimate history of bizarre cattle mutilations and UFO activity. I've been there myself, and in fact, I spoke to members of the Gomez family in Dulce some years ago. This is a family that lost, I think, over 50 head of cattle to mutilations during that period of time. There's reason to think that it might be beyond human, and there's reason to think that there were definitely human intelligence operators there as well. There's a lot of strange things that happened over at Dulce. So, and over at Dulce, you've got Mount Archuleta and Archuleta Peak. Yeah, I think that's it. So there's these two large structures there, and there have long been rumors of underground facilities there, and in fact, I think that there probably were underground facilities there. I recall distinctly speaking to Edmundo Gomez many years ago. He was the son of the senior Gomez at the time, and Edmundo told me, he said, look, in the early 70s, we could hear all kinds of construction sounds coming out of there, and we all believed, he said, that there was some kind of construction going on at Dulce. That's his opinion. In any case, Doty, at one point, takes Benowitz either on a helicopter or aircraft, I can't remember which, and they fly around Archuleta Peak. And Benowitz draws the conclusion that there is an underground base there. And I think this is how Greg Bishop wrote about this in his study of this called Project Beta, that there were like these fake artifacts put up by the Air Force to make Benowitz think that there was all of this activity going on, and make him think there was a big UFO thing happening there. And also to lead him away from his fixation on Kirtland, to get him to look at Dulce. That was part of this, at least according to Bishop's research.
Roger, we copy. We're moving this forward. Penniston never talked about any of that taking place until after he went under hypnosis, and that's when it came out that he had sodium pentothal used on him, and he was interrogated. But he told them what happened and wrote it down, and they came back and gave him a statement on what he was going to give to the chain of command.
On December 26, 1980, Great Britain's most notorious UFO incident occurred at a United States Air Force base in Rendlesham Forest. Security personnel Jim Penniston, John Burroughs, and Edward Cabansag were alerted by radio that a UFO was seen moving in the forest on the perimeter of the base. They made their way out to the edge of the forest, and as they made their way in, eventually they stood right in front of something they could only describe as being from out of this world. This small triangular metallic craft had strange symbols etched into its surface. It emanated a vibrant glow that lit up the canopy of the forest, and it was almost soundless. It is said that the craft took off in an instant from the forest floor as if it disappeared into the night sky before them. These three eyewitnesses made their way back to the base by car, where many other observers of the UFO were stationed. As they arrived, they were surprised to have men in civilian clothing waiting for them. And to quote John Burroughs, "There were gentlemen there with sunglasses who took Jim and Ed off somewhere. We no longer saw them after we traded in our weapons, and I felt betrayed because they wouldn't talk to me anymore. What was said to them to clam them up so tight? I have no idea." This story follows an age-old pattern of a prominent Men in Black cover-up. A UFO incident occurs. Experiencers witness something that shouldn't exist in our conventionally understood reality. A meeting then follows between these experiencers and the men in black, which strikes fear in them to never speak about what they saw or experienced.
We've got to get to it. We've got to get to it. We've got to know what it was. Two people that were involved identified Green as being there, and Doty also said that Green came in. There was three teams that came in, CIA, OSI, and NSA, that came in involved right after this happened.
I served in the United States Air Force for 6 years, from 1992 to 1998. First 3 years were at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, and the other 3 years were at Fort George G. Meade in Maryland, the home of NSA. Now, my role for NSA was as a computer technician, primarily systems and network administration for a specific surveillance group. I cannot get into specifics of what exactly we were surveilling, but essentially I offered computer support for those that were performing this function. Of course, I had a top secret clearance, a TSS SCI clearance specifically, and that is very compartmentalized. Now, on occasion, we did have a need to exit the NSA campus and go to an off-site location. And there are a plethora of these types of locations across the country. And these locations were basically hidden in plain sight. You know, they would be at, just small, maybe strip malls that were, out of the way. So they just had some local businesses, some different offices, that sort of thing. And when we would have to go to these locations, we could not arrive in our military attire. They did not want it to be known that this was actually a government operation and the military was involved. So we are required as protocol to dress in black suits and a tie to go to these locations.
And I've got actually an email from one of the OSI agents that was involved that confirmed all this. It's telling us to come to it. We can feel it. I personally was never have a memory of having that happen to me. Now, there's other people that were there that have talked to me and said they saw me come up, they saw me go into the same place they were involved with and everything else. But my personal recollection, which I have a lot of missing parts, the fact is that different people remember being interrogated. I just don't. And I don't know if they were able to block it all out of my mind, or I don't know. And I've never tried to sell that. The only thing I ever did was that I went out there a second time, and that's when I disappeared for a while.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Was that an MIB experience? Black helicopters, military abductions that happen. Sometimes people are taken and they talk about then being visited by, military personnel and debriefed about their abduction.
So Dan Aykroyd, the actor, the comedian, has a very interesting story about Men in Black as well. And it's funny, I have my own little oblique connection to this, very, very small. But in 2002, Dan Aykroyd had a TV show called Out There. And it was a UFO show. Dan Aykroyd, of course, everyone knows Dan Aykroyd is very interested in UFOs. He's very knowledgeable. He knows this field. He's very sophisticated with it. And he wanted to do a serious treatment of the UFO subject. And in fact, this is 2002, and I was one of the new guys in the field at that time, and I had actually myself gotten communication from his team, and they were interested in interviewing me for this show. So I was excited. I thought, well, this is awesome. Maybe I'll get to meet Dan Aykroyd, And then I discovered, no, the show fell through, no more, and I won't get my opportunity. So what's interesting is that the day that show was canceled has a very interesting story. So according to what Aykroyd said, he's out taking a break, having a smoke outside, and there's a very unsettling man in black who's at some distance, but I don't think that far, who's staring at him. It's unsettling to Aykroyd. The man is dressed in black. He's got a black car. He looks away and then looks over, and the man and the car are gone. apparently in such a way that it didn't make sense to him, that it just disappeared in such a way. Right after that, he's back inside. He gets a phone call from his producer, who tells him, without an explanation, by the way, that the show's been canceled, no more shooting, it's over. End of story. Big mystery.
It was, oh, hi, Brittany, sure. Oh, of course, I'd love to. Guy gives me a dirty look. Oh, well, sure. Car gone. That's what happened. And then 2 hours later, we were told we were not to continue taping, and the show was canceled, and none of them would air. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Was that an MIB experience?
So there's a very interesting, let's say creepy video that is available of two apparent men in black. And this has to do with an event that took place at Niagara Falls. Now, I don't know the date of this. The video itself was posted to YouTube in 2013, and it's very interesting. So what you have is a situation where a hotel employee at Niagara Falls, the night before, apparently had shot a very impressive video of a vivid and I think large UFO over Niagara Falls. The very next day, called in sick. And on that day that he had called in sick, there are these very two odd men, very intimidating looking men. And all of this is caught on the hotel security camera. And it's interesting because you see all the hotel traffic, people coming in and out of the hotel. And then you see these two fairly large men in these big black trench coats with hats. And at least one of the people there is like obviously intimidated by them and walks away. You can see that in the video. So they go in. And furthermore, when you see, at least to my view, one of them walked in a very odd way. Like his feet were not positioned the way that you would normally see. If you look carefully, like his feet are positioned in an odd way. In any case, what's interesting about the video is you have one person primarily, but there's two people in this video talking. But these are the hotel employees, and they're describing what happened in this encounter. And essentially, they come in and they're looking for this employee who's not there. And they scare the hell out of this one woman who's working there. She gets to deal with these two giant men in these big black trench coats with these enormous blue eyes that never blink, according to her. And they're scaring her to death, asking for this guy. And she actually just broke down crying during the encounter, apparently. According to the person telling the story, who's another employee, a coworker of hers. They wanted this film. They wanted this video. And they, you know, what's very interesting is that you've got this recording on a hotel security camera. And the only, you know, what's going on here? It's either a massive hoax that the entire hotel staff wanted to participate in and create this thing. All right, I suppose that's a possibility. Or it's true, or it really happened the way that it seems to happen. And I don't know what to say about it. You know, I don't know the names of any of the people, and have they been interviewed subsequently? Do we have names? What happened to the employee? What happened to the film that he shot, the video? There's a lot of unanswered questions in this story. Like, we just have to acknowledge that. On the other hand, when you look at this, you listen to it, look, I just have to say, it sounds potentially believable. And I have to leave it at that. I don't know what my full determination is on this for all time, but I certainly will admit it catches my imagination. It really makes me wonder if it actually did happen.
And he said they were wearing black suits, black trench coats. They were wearing like the old-fashioned Federo hats. They had extremely, extremely pale skin. And he said they came in and they asked for you. And I said, I'm sorry, he's actually not working today. And it seemed like they didn't believe me. So they started to walk around the hotel, and shortly after they went to the tour desk. But he goes, they freaked me out, and I really wanted to tell you that there were these weird guys in here looking for you.
UFO encounters have been mired in suppression, skepticism, and covert tactics termed the truth embargo. This truth has now been considered credible and worth investigating by the Department of Defense. A recent news release indicates the military is again funding research to the UAP, otherwise known as the UFO phenomenon. If there is a long history of information suppression quite evident, then should we trust the newfound interest in the UFO phenomenon by the US government? Should witnesses and experiencers be the ones in which we look to for information regarding this reality? Perhaps the government should be the safe place to consider relevant information on the topic. If that is the case, then the US government will have to regain the public trust and undo decades of the truth embargo enacted by the men in black. The government would have to admit to the said suppression of information in the past, provide reparations for those targeted by the men in black, release all the credible documentation that has been scrutinized by the US Department of Defense over the past 70 years, and finally, provide a clear explanation for how this should affect everyone's belief system going forward. We are not alone. The real question is, will the powers that be ever stop using men in black tactics to control the narrative?
Take the hills and I'll just keep this dusty road. Let's get out together.